I'm quietly failing, the bakery owner confessed to the moving man at 9 p.m. Then what he said made her realize she wasn't. Bridget Colson stood in the middle of her own kitchen, watching two strangers in matching gray t-shirts wrap furniture blankets around her three-door reach-in refrigerator, and every instinct in her body wanted to grab the blanket out of their hands and do it herself. Even though she'd never actually moved commercial refrigeration equipment in her life, and had no earthly idea if she was doing it right either way. The Bishop brothers' moving truck idled at the curb outside Wheatfield Bakery, exhaust curling up into a gray October morning, and somewhere behind her, taped to the front window in blue painter's tape, a handwritten sign read, "Closed for relocation. Back in 3 days. Thank you for 6 wonderful years." 6 years of building this place from a folding table at the farmer's market into an actual storefront with her own name on the lease. And now the lease itself was the problem. The landlord raising rent 40% at renewal without so much as a phone call first, forcing Bridget into a smaller space 2 miles south on Maple, across the neighborhood line where rent hadn't spiked yet. A place that cost less but scared her twice as much, because smaller meant less room for error, and this whole business had never had much room for error to begin with. She'd started Wheatfield with a card table at the Saturday farmer's market, selling sourdough loaves out of her own kitchen before the health department made her formalize things, and 6 years of 5 a.m. proofing schedules and slowly building up 6 steady wholesale accounts with local coffee shops and a brunch spot 2 blocks over had turned that card table into an actual business with actual employees. 2 of them, both part-time, both counting on her to figure out how to keep the doors open through a move she hadn't budgeted for and couldn't really afford it either way. "Ma'am, you want this one wrapped or crated?" The voice belonged to the crew lead, the one who'd introduced himself at the door 20 minutes earlier, with a clipboard and a handshake firm enough to mean something. He was crouched beside her commercial mixer, running his hand along the base to check how it was bolted to the floor before he'd even suggested moving it an inch. "Wrapped's fine," Bridget said, hovering closer than she probably needed to. "That mixer's 12 years old, and the manufacturer doesn't even make replacement parts for the motor housing anymore. So if it gets so much as a dent—" "It won't," he said, not defensive about it, just factual, already pulling moving blankets off his shoulder and working them around the machine's corners with the kind of quick, practice folds that told her this wasn't his first commercial kitchen. "We're going to tilt it back on the hand truck, strap it here and here so the weight rides low, and walk it out the same way we brought the empty crates in. 2 guys on the truck, nobody rushes a 200-pound mixer down a loading ramp." "Emmett," one of his crew called from the doorway, "refrigerator's strapped and ready for the dolly whenever you want it." Bridget filed the name away without meaning to, watching him straighten up and cross the kitchen to check the cooler strapping himself before giving the go-ahead. The same careful double-check he'd given the mixer, treating the reach-in refrigerator with exactly as much respect as if it belonged to somebody twice as important as a woman running a 6-year-old neighborhood bakery. "You always check everything twice?" Bridget asked, following him toward the back. "Compressor units are the easiest thing to wreck on a job like this," Emmett said, tightening a ratchet strap another quarter turn. "Tip one at the wrong angle and refrigerant oil floods into the cooling coils. Then you're looking at a full 24-hour waiting period before you can even power it back on, or you risk burning out the compressor on startup. That's 3 days of downtime plus an $800 repair bill nobody budgeted for. Costs me 30 seconds to check the strap angle. Costs you a lot more if I don't." Bridget hadn't expected an actual explanation, had braced herself for the kind of vague reassurance most people gave when they didn't really know what they were doing, but wanted to sound confident anyway. And something about getting the real mechanics of it instead eased a knot in her shoulders that had been sitting there since the lease renewal letter first showed up in her mailbox 3 weeks earlier. "You've moved commercial kitchens before," she said, half a question. "Enough of them," Emmett said, not elaborating further. And something in the flat, closed-off way he said it told her there was more to that sentence than he was offering up on a Tuesday morning to a stranger, so she didn't push. She noticed, too, that he never once glanced at his phone the whole morning, never took the kind of long, unexplained breaks some contractors padded a job with, just worked steady through it the way somebody works when the job itself is the only thing keeping their hands busy enough not to think about something else entirely. They worked through the morning in a rhythm that surprised her, Bridget pointing out which items needed, Which kind of care? Proofing cabinets that couldn't tip past a certain angle without the racks sliding loose inside. A display case with glass panels original to the building that predated her lease by decades. A commercial espresso machine Bridget had saved 2 years to buy used from a closing cafe downtown. A rack of half-sheet pans that could just get stacked and taped without much ceremony at all. And Emmett's crew adjusting their approach to each one without complaint, treating a $2 sheet pan in a $4,000 proofing cabinet with proportionally correct amounts of caution instead of babying everything equally the way an inexperienced crew might have. The proofing cabinet gave them the closest call of the whole morning, a younger crew member named Dario starting to tip it back onto the hand truck at an angle Emmett caught from across the room before anybody else had even registered the problem. "Hold up," Emmett said, crossing the kitchen fast but not panicked about it, one hand steadying the cabinet's frame. "That door's not latched. Tip it that far back with the door swinging free. You're going to crack the hinge pin clean off, and that's a part you can't just order same day." Dario reset the angle, latched the door properly, and the cabinet went on to the hand truck, cleaned the second time. No harm done, Bridget's held breath finally releasing once the wheels started rolling toward the door. It was close to noon when Bridget carried out the one item she hadn't trusted to anybody else. A wooden rolling pin worn smooth and slightly bowed from use, wrapped in a dish towel and tucked under one arm like a football. Emmett noticed her carrying it separately from everything else and asked, not prying, just curious, "That one's not going in a box?" "It was my grandmother's," Bridget said, running her thumb along the worn handle out of habit. "She's the one who taught me to bake, back before I could even see over her kitchen counter. This thing's older than I am and probably worth about $4 to anybody else, but I'm not letting it ride in a truck with the sheet pans." Emmett looked at the rolling pin for a second longer than the moment strictly required, something shifting in his expression that Bridget couldn't quite place. "Smart," he said finally. "Some things you carry yourself. Everything else, that's what the truck's for." By early afternoon, the kitchen stood mostly empty, echoing in the particular way a space does once everything that gave it life has been carried out of it. And Bridget stood in the doorway, watching Emmett's crew do a final walkthrough with a checklist, confirming nothing had been left behind, nothing forgotten in a cabinet or a drawer that would turn up missing at the new location tomorrow. "That's everything," Emmett said, coming back to where she stood, wiping his hands on a rag that had started the day considerably cleaner than it looked now. "Trucks loaded, loads balanced so nothing shifts on the drive, and your refrigerator's strapped tight enough that I'd stake my own paycheck on it, arriving exactly the way it left here." "You say that with a lot of confidence for a guy who's known me 4 hours," Bridget said. "I say it with a lot of confidence because I know what a properly loaded truck looks like," Emmett said, something dry in it that made Bridget almost smile despite the exhaustion sitting heavy behind her eyes. "Confidence in you, that's a different conversation. Confidence in a ratchet strap, that one I've got plenty of." Bridget laughed, short and real, the first genuine laugh she'd managed all day, and something about the specific, unglamorous honesty of his answer landed better than any smooth reassurance could have. "Fair enough," she said. "What time tomorrow?" "How many of these do you do a week?" Bridget asked, curious now, watching him do a final check of the truck's tie-down straps. "Commercial kitchen moves, I mean. Feels like a pretty specific skill set." 2, 3, depends on the season," Emmett said. "Restaurants closing, restaurants relocating, catering outfits outgrowing a garage kitchen. This time of year especially, a lot of small places either expand into something bigger or fold entirely before winter hits, and the slow months eat whatever cushion they had left." He said it plainly, no particular weight attached, but Bridget caught something underneath it anyway. The specific practiced neutrality of a man who'd said that sentence enough times that it didn't cost him anything to say out loud anymore, even if it once had. 8 sharp, Emmett said. "New space is smaller, which means we've got to be smarter about the order we bring things in, or we'll end up boxing ourselves into a corner with the proofing cabinets before the mixer's even through the door." "You've clearly thought about this more than I have," Bridget admitted. "It's the job," Emmett said, shrugging like it wasn't much of anything, though the careful, methodical way he'd handled every single piece of her business all day told a different story than the shrug did. 6 years you built this place up from nothing. Least I can do is not be the guy who dents the mixer on the way to the next chapter of it. Most guys in this business, they see it as boxes and hours, Bridget said, watching him coil a length of strap over his shoulder. You keep talking about it like it matters what's actually inside the boxes. Emmett considered that for a second before answering, like he was deciding how honest to actually be with somebody he'd known less than a day. Guess I've just seen enough of what it costs somebody to build a place like this from nothing, he said finally, that I'd rather spend the extra 30 seconds checking a strap than be the reason 6 years of somebody's life gets loaded wrong onto a truck. He didn't elaborate further, and Bridget didn't ask him to, filing the sentence away instead, the same careful way he'd packed her display case. Bridget looked at him for a second, something in that sentence landing harder than he'd probably intended, and found herself wondering as she locked the empty storefront's door behind her that evening and watched the moving truck pull away down the street, with everything she'd built loaded carefully inside it. Whether the man driving it understood exactly how much weight he was actually carrying, and not just the kind measured in pounds. She drove her own car the 2 miles to the new address after locking up, just to see the truck parked outside the smaller storefront one more time before dark, and found Emmett already unloading the first crate of sheet pans by himself. No rush to it, working the same careful rhythm he'd kept up all day, even with nobody left around to see it. He caught her watching from the sidewalk and lifted a hand in a plain, unhurried wave. And Bridget lifted one back, and neither of them made more of it than that. 2 tired people at the end of a long Tuesday, 1 truck's worth of somebody's whole business, sitting safe in the cold October dark between them. Bridget Colson stood in her half-unpacked new kitchen on a Thursday morning, watching the county health inspector clip a violation notice to his clipboard. And the specific sinking weight of that red-inked paperwork told her everything she needed to know before he even said a word out loud. What started as one failed inspection 3 days before her scheduled reopening turned into the stretch where Bridget finally let somebody else see exactly how close to the edge she'd actually been running this whole business. And Emmett turned out to be the first person in years she trusted enough to say it to. "Panel's undersized for what you're pulling," the inspector said, not unkind about it, just matter of fact in the way people get when they've delivered this exact news to a dozen other small business owners already that month. "Your commercial oven alone needs a dedicated 50-amp, 240-volt circuit, and this building's main panel is still running the same 100-amp service it had back when this space was a dry cleaner. Add your proofing cabinets and the refrigerator compressor on top of that, and you're looking at a serious overload risk. I can't sign off on occupancy until that panel gets upgraded, and the oven's got its own properly grounded circuit, full stop." "How long does something like that usually take?" Bridget asked, already doing the math on lost income before she'd finished the sentence. "Depends who you can get out here," the inspector said, tucking his clipboard under one arm. "Licensed electrician, permit pulled through the city, inspection scheduled after the work's done. Busy season for that trade this time of year. Restaurants all trying to get build-outs finished before the holidays. Could be 2 weeks if you're lucky, longer if you're not." 2 weeks she absolutely could not afford, not with a signed lease on the new space and the old lease already terminated, not with 2 part-time employees counting on hours, not with 6 wholesale accounts that would find another supplier fast if Wheatfield went dark for a month instead of the 3 days the sign in her old window had promised. She'd already called her 2 employees, Priya and Jordan, a college student who handled the early morning bake shift 4 days a week before her afternoon classes, to tell them the reopening would slip. The flat, careful way both of them had said "don't worry about it" only made Bridget feel worse, because she could hear the worry underneath the reassurance "just fine." She spent an hour that evening handwriting a new sign on poster board, "Reopening delayed due to electrical inspection." Back Saturday. She taped it over the old 3-day promise, photographed it, and posted it to the bakery's Instagram before the first customer could show up Monday to a locked door. She was still standing in the kitchen doing that same anxious math an hour later when Emmett's truck pulled up outside, stopping by to drop off a hand truck she'd borrowed during the move, and one look at her face told him something had gone sideways since he'd left the day before. "Inspection didn't go well," he said, not a question. "Panel's too small. Oven needs its own dedicated circuit. and the whole building needs a service upgrade before the county will sign off on anything. Bridget rubbed her hands over her face, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Inspector said 2 weeks minimum to get an electrician out here, and I don't have 2 weeks. I've got a lease payment due on a space I can't legally use yet, and every day I'm closed, I'm bleeding wholesale accounts to whoever fills my order instead. I called 4 licensed electricians this morning. Fastest timeline any of them could offer was 3 weeks out. One of them laughed when I asked about expediting. Emmett didn't offer to fix it himself, didn't pretend to know more about residential and commercial electrical code than he actually did, just pulled out his phone. "I'm not an electrician," he said, "but would you mind if I made a call? Guy I know might be able to move faster than 3 weeks. At this point, I'll take any help I can get," Bridget said. He started scrolling through contacts with the specific efficiency of somebody who'd built up a real network over years of working alongside every trade adjacent to his own. He'd moved enough commercial kitchens to know a couple electricians who specialized in restaurant build-outs, and one of them owed him a favor from a job that went sideways last spring. He called a man named Dale Ferris, a licensed electrician who did most of his work through restaurant build-outs, and knew the specific headache of a small business owner staring down a closed sign they couldn't afford. And within the call, Dale agreed to swing by that same afternoon to look at the panel himself. No promises on scheduling, but willing to bump Bridget up his list given the circumstances, and given that Emmett had personally vouched for the timeline mattering. Dale showed up at 4 and walked the panel himself, tracing the existing wiring with a flashlight and a voltage tester, checking the main breaker's amperage rating stamped on its housing against the load. Bridget's equipment would actually draw once everything ran at once. Inside of 20 minutes, he'd confirmed the inspector's assessment. "Building's got 200 amp service from the pole already," he said, shaking his head, "but somebody cheaped out and installed a 100 amp split bus panel that can't handle your actual load. Dry cleaning equipment pulls different amperage than a commercial oven running at full temp for 8 hours a day. Full panel replacement to a modern 200 amp breaker panel, plus a dedicated 50 amp circuit run specifically to the oven." He quoted her a price that made Bridget's fingers go still on the countertop. Real money she hadn't budgeted for on top of a move she already couldn't fully afford. But he also told her, once he saw how tight her timeline actually was, that he could get the work done within 4 days if she didn't mind him working around her unpacking schedule instead of asking her to clear out again. "I know the permit coordinator at City Hall personally," Dale said, already pulling out his phone. "I'll call in a favor. Get the plan review expedited to 2 business days instead of the usual week. Submit Friday, approved by end of Monday, start work Tuesday morning." 4 days of work instead of 2 weeks waiting, Bridget said once Dale had left. "How did you make that happen?" "Didn't make anything happen," Emmett said, leaning against the newly cleared counter. "Dale's a good electrician who happened to have a slow week and a favor he owed me. That's not magic. That's just knowing the right people in a small enough industry that everybody's connected to everybody eventually." "Still," Bridget said, "thank you. I mean that." They ended up spending most of that evening together anyway. Bridget, too, wired to go home and actually rest, Emmett sticking around under the excuse of helping her finish unpacking the dry storage shelving. Both of them working in the kind of comfortable, unhurried silence that had built up steadily since that first Tuesday morning. Around 8:30, Emmett walked to the gas station on the corner and came back with 2 shrink-wrapped sandwiches and a bag of chips. The kind of meal neither of them had the energy to improve on. It was close to 9, both of them sitting on overturned crates, that Bridget finally said the thing she'd been carrying since the inspector's clipboard first came out. "I keep telling myself this move is just a smart business decision," she said, turning her sandwich wrapper over in her hands. "Cheaper rent, smaller footprint, all the things a business consultant would tell you to do. But some nights it just feels like I'm quietly failing and dressing it up as a strategy so I don't have to say the real word out loud." Emmett was quiet for a second, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped into something more careful than his usual dry, practical register. "I know exactly what that feels like," he said. 4 years ago, I co-owned a moving company with a guy I'd known since high school. Built it up from 2 trucks to 6 over about 3 years. Actually looked like it was going to work. Then he started making calls behind my back, cutting insurance coverage to save money without telling me, taking cash jobs off the books that I didn't find out about until the IRS did. Company folded inside of 6 months once it all came apart. Between the back taxes and penalties from his unreported cash income, the vendor bills that went unpaid when the accounts dried up, and the business line of credit I'd personally co-signed, I walked away owing $43,000 for decisions I didn't even make. Bridget set her sandwich down, giving him her full attention. That's not a small thing to carry. Still paying it off, Emmett admitted. 4 years later, still sending $300 a month to creditors for a business that doesn't exist anymore, which is about all I can spare on a crew lead's salary, still working crew lead for somebody else's company instead of running my own. Because the one time I trusted my judgment enough to build something, it blew up in a way that had nothing to do with the work and everything to do with trusting the wrong person. He looked at her steadily. So when I say I know what it feels like to watch something you built with your own hands start to slip, I'm not just being nice about it. I actually know. Is that why you check every strap twice? Bridget asked, gentler now. Why you talked about the boxes like they mattered? Probably, Emmett said. Guess I figured out the hard way that the stuff inside somebody's boxes represents years of their life. They can't get back if it gets wrecked. Same as mine did. Doesn't cost me anything extra to treat it that way. Wish somebody had treated my business with that kind of care back when it mattered. They sat with that for a moment, the dry storage shelving half finished around them, the smell of cardboard and fresh sawdust from the new construction still hanging in the air. And something between them settled into a different register than it had held all week. Less like a business owner and her contractor, more like two people who'd each been quietly bracing for their own version of the same collapse. Why crew lead, though? Bridget asked, curious now. Why not start over somewhere else entirely? A different trade, something with no connection to what fell apart. Thought about it, Emmett admitted, but moving's the only thing I actually know how to do well, and I like it more than I probably let on most days. Watching somebody's whole life get loaded onto a truck and arrive exactly the way it left, that's satisfying work even when it's not my own name on the company anymore. Figured I'd rather do the thing I'm good at for somebody else's outfit than start over doing something I'm mediocre at, just to avoid the reminder. For what it's worth, Bridget said finally, your business folding because a partner lied to you isn't the same as you failing. That's a pretty important difference. Tell that to the lender, Emmett said, dry again, though something in his eyes had eased slightly at hearing her say it out loud. I'm telling you, Bridget said, not the lender. You. Dale's crew showed up Tuesday morning right on schedule, running new conduit through the ceiling, while Bridget and her 2 part-time employees worked around them, finishing the dry storage and getting the display case properly leveled. Bridget had spent those 4 days doing her own part of the work too, calling every wholesale account personally instead of letting them find out secondhand that Wheatfield had gone quiet. Walking Priya and Jordan through a revised schedule so neither of them lost the hours they were counting on. Refusing to let the delay turn into the kind of silent unraveling she might have let it become a year earlier, before she'd learned that most problems shrank considerably once you said them out loud to the people they actually affected. By Friday afternoon, 4 working days exactly the way Dale had promised, the city electrical inspector came through, tested the new panel and the oven's dedicated circuit with a voltage meter, and signed off on the permit without a single note of hesitation. By end of day, the county health department confirmed the electrical occupancy issue was resolved and issued final approval to open. Bridget stood in her own kitchen holding that signed paperwork like it might disappear if she set it down, and looked up to find Emmett standing in the doorway, having stopped by on his lunch break specifically to see how the inspection went. We're clear, Bridget said, holding up the paper. Opening Saturday. Told you 4 days, Emmett said, something genuinely pleased breaking through his usual dry delivery, and for the first time since the failed inspection first landed, Bridget let herself actually believe that this move, and whatever else was building alongside it, might turn out to be more than just a strategy she was dressing up to survive. Dale's crew was already loading their van at the curb, the new panel humming clean and steady behind its cabinet door, And somewhere in the kitchen, the oven Bridget had worried about for a full week finally clicked on to preheat for its first real batch in the new space. The specific electrical hum of 200 amps doing exactly the job 100 amps never could have managed. Bridget Colson counted 4 separate times in 4 days that Emmett Cole showed up at Wheatfield Bakery on his own clock, off the books, doing work nobody had asked him to do and nobody was paying him for. And by the fourth time, she'd stopped being simply grateful and started actually paying attention to the pattern underneath it. What started as one man's genuine kindness turned into the week. Bridget realized she needed to say something honest before Saturday's reopening turned into a celebration built on top of somebody quietly running themselves into the ground to prove he deserved to be standing there at all. The pattern had started small enough that Bridget almost missed it entirely. Tuesday, Emmett showed up after his actual shift ended to fix a wobbly shelf bracket in the dry storage room. A 20-minute job he stretched into an hour by also reorganizing the whole shelving unit while he was at it. Wednesday, he arrived before his shift started to help unload a flour delivery that Bridget and Jordan could have handled fine on their own, then stuck around afterward to sweep a stockroom that didn't particularly need sweeping. Thursday, he drove across town on his lunch break to pick up a part for the display case's broken light fixture, paid for it out of his own pocket, and waved off Bridget's attempt to reimburse him so quickly that she didn't manage to get a word in before he'd changed the subject entirely. None of it was unwelcome exactly, and none of it was small either. At least 4 unpaid hours across 4 days, on top of his actual 40-hour week with Bishop Brothers, the kind of pace that would run anybody down eventually. And Bridget found herself watching him move through her kitchen with the same restless, can't-sit-still energy she recognized from her own worst weeks running the business alone. The exact energy of somebody who'd convinced themselves that stopping meant failing. By Friday evening, the night before the actual reopening, Bridget found him in the kitchen at 9 o'clock, well past any reasonable hour for a man who had his own 6 a.m. shift the next morning, meticulously realigning shelf liner that had been perfectly straight to begin with. "Emmett," she said, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, "it's 9 at night. You've got work in 9 hours. Go home." "Just finishing this up," he said, not looking up from the shelf. "Wanted it right for tomorrow." "It was already right," Bridget said. "You did that shelf liner yesterday. This is the 3rd time you fixed something that wasn't actually broken this week." Emmett's hand stilled on the liner, and something in his shoulders went tight in a way Bridget recognized now. The same defensive posture he'd carried the day he first told her about his old business collapsing. "Just trying to help," he said, quieter now. "Figured the least I could do, given everything." "Given everything what?" Bridget interrupted, gentle but direct. "Given that you helped me find an electrician? Given that you moved my mixer without denting it? I already thanked you for both of those things properly. You don't owe me 4 extra unpaid hours a week on top of it." "That's not what this is," Emmett said, though his voice didn't carry the conviction the words were supposed to. "I think it might be," Bridget said, sitting down on an overturned crate across from him. "I think every time you show up here doing something nobody asked for, some part of you is trying to prove you won't be the reason this place falls apart. The way your old business fell apart, even though those two things have nothing to do with each other. I'm not your old partner, Emmett. I'm not going to disappear on you or cut corners behind your back. You don't have to earn your way into being trusted here by working yourself into the ground." Emmett sat with that for a long moment, the shelf liner forgotten in his hands, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost the deflecting edge it usually carried. "4 years I've been the guy who checks everything 3 times because the one time I trusted somebody else's judgment, it cost me everything," he admitted. "Guess some part of me figured if I just kept doing enough, kept being useful enough, nobody around me would ever get the chance to let me down again. Or worse, I wouldn't give anybody a reason to walk away from me either." "I don't need you to be useful, Emmett," Bridget said, her voice steady. "I need you to be here because you want to be, not because you're running some kind of debt you think you owe me. Those are 2 completely different things, and I'd rather have the second one, even if it means fewer perfectly aligned shelf liners." Something in Emmett's face shifted, the tightness easing by degrees, and he let out a breath that sounded like it had been sitting in his chest for longer than just that week. "Okay," he said. "I hear you. I'll work on that." "I mean it," Bridget said. I'm not asking you to stop caring. I'm asking you to trust that I'll actually tell you if something's wrong instead of you having to guess and overcompensate for a problem that might not even exist. She leaned forward slightly, elbows on her knees. Your old partner lied to you. That's a real thing that happened, and I'm not gonna pretend it didn't leave a mark. But I'm not him, and this bakery isn't that moving company. And I need you to believe that on the nights when it's just the two of us in an empty kitchen and there's nothing left to fix. That might take me a minute, Emmett admitted. Believing it, I mean. Not agreeing with you. I already agree with you. That's fair, Bridget said. Take the minute. Just take it somewhere that isn't my dry storage room at 9 o'clock at night. You don't have to fix it tonight, Bridget said, standing and holding out a hand to pull him up off the floor. Go home. Sleep. Show up tomorrow because you want to see the place open, not because you think you owe it another hour of unpaid labor first. He took her hand, let her pull him to his feet, and for a moment they just stood there in the quiet kitchen, the new panel humming steady behind its cabinet door, the smell of tomorrow's proofing dough already rising in covered bins along the counter. Thanks, Emmett said finally, for saying that instead of just letting me keep doing it. That's what people who actually care about each other do, Bridget said. They say the hard thing instead of the easy thing. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear, frost silvering the sidewalk outside Wheatfield's new front window, and by 6:15, 45 minutes before the 7 a.m. opening, Bridget stood behind the counter watching Priya arrange the last tray of pastries in the display case, while Jordan wiped down the espresso machine one final time, the whole space smelling like fresh bread and hot coffee and the particular electricity of a business finally, actually alive again in a new location. Emmett showed up at 6:45, not in his work uniform, not with a toolbox or a checklist, just in a clean flannel shirt with his hands empty for the first time since Bridget had met him. He didn't head for the kitchen to fix something. He walked straight to the counter, ordered a coffee like an actual customer, and paid for it with cash from his own wallet before Bridget could wave it off. You're paying for that? Bridget asked, raising an eyebrow. Wouldn't feel right otherwise, Emmett said, sliding the cash across the counter. This is your grand reopening. I'm just here to drink coffee and watch it happen, same as anybody else walking through that door in 15 minutes. Bridget rang him up properly, handed him his change, and something about the plain, ordinary transaction, a customer buying a coffee from a business he genuinely believed in, instead of a man trying to earn his place in it through free labor, made Bridget stop rearranging the pastry tray she'd been fidgeting with and just watch him sit down, the first still moment she'd allowed herself all morning. The doors opened at 7 sharp, and within the first 20 minutes the regulars started filing in. Familiar faces from the old location who'd found the new address through the calls Bridget had personally made during the delay, along with a handful of curious new customers drawn in by the smell alone as they walked past. One of her wholesale accounts, the owner of a coffee shop 2 streets over, stopped by in person just to shake Bridget's hand and confirm their standing order was picking back up starting Monday. Bridget finally let the wholesale account ledger she'd been carrying in her back pocket for 2 weeks stay closed on the counter, no longer checking it every 20 minutes the way she had since the lease letter first arrived. A woman Bridget didn't recognize came in around 9:30, ordered a sourdough loaf and a coffee, and mentioned offhand that she'd followed Wheatfield's move on the community Facebook group where a neighbor had posted about the reopening. A small, ordinary reminder that the calls and the patience and the 4 extra unbudgeted days had all actually mattered to people beyond the wholesale accounts Bridget had been tracking so carefully on a legal pad taped inside a cabinet door. On the shelf behind the register, propped in a small wooden stand Bridget had picked up specifically for the purpose, sat her grandmother's rolling pin, no longer wrapped in a dish towel and tucked under an arm for safekeeping, just displayed plain and simple where every customer walking up to the counter could see it. The same worn-bowed wood that had survived a farmer's market card table and a full storefront, and now this smaller, harder one second chapter too. Emmett stayed the whole morning, not working, not fixing anything, just sitting at the small 2-top table by the window with his coffee, occasionally getting up to help a regular find a seat or hold the door for somebody juggling a stroller in a pastry box, small, ordinary kindnesses that had nothing to do with debt or proving anything at all. When an older customer with a cane struggled to navigate the door with a pastry box balanced in one hand, Emmett walked over without being asked and held it open. A small gesture that took 2 seconds and that he mentioned to no one afterward. The same instinct that had made him check a ratchet strap twice on the very first day, except now it read less like penance and more like simply who he was. Around 11, during a lull between the morning rush and the lunch crowd, Bridget came around the counter and sat down across from him for the first time all day. "Busy morning," she said, finally letting herself exhale. "Good busy," Emmett said. "The kind you actually wanted." Bridget looked around the small, crowded, noisy space. Every table full, the espresso machine hissing steady behind the counter, her grandmother's rolling pin catching the morning light on its shelf, and felt something settle into place that had nothing to do with electrical panels or wholesale accounts or any of the practical crises of the last 2 weeks. "Yeah," she said, "it really is." She glanced over at him, the same steady, unhurried presence that had checked her mixer's straps twice on a cold October morning weeks earlier, and thought about how much distance sat between a man who showed up because he felt he owed something and a man who showed up simply because he wanted to be there, and how grateful she was that he'd finally let himself become the second one. Outside the window, the frost on the sidewalk had already burned off under the late morning sun, and a line of customers, 3 deep, stretched toward the door of a bakery that, 2 weeks ago, hadn't even had power enough to run its own oven.